The screen is black. Soft, ominous music begins to play. Text fades in and out. In the shadows of our society, there are stories that lie dormant. Tales of horror so profound, they feel like the whispers of a nightmare. But sometimes, the nightmare is real. The music swells slightly. The channel's logo animates on screen. Before we descend into one of the most chilling cases this nation has ever witnessed, I want to invite you to become part of our community. If you appreciate deep dives into the mysteries that haunt us, take a moment to click that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. Every subscription helps us to keep unearthing these forgotten narratives. Your support is invaluable. The logo fades. The screen cuts to a slow-motion shot of rain hitting a pristine, white gift box with a crimson ribbon. Now, prepare yourselves. We're about to open a gift that no one ever asked for, and uncover a story of vengeance so meticulous and so brutal, it held a nation captive in fear. This is the case of the human head gifts and the brutal revenge killing by dismemberment that terrified the nation. The rain that fell on the city of Viridia that autumn was relentless. A cold, gray sheet that washed the color from the world and drove people indoors, cocooning them in a false sense of security. It was a city of glass towers and old money, a place where secrets were currency and reputations were as fragile as spun sugar. It was in this city of stark contrasts that the first box appeared. It was delivered to the sprawling, oak-lined estate of Judge Alistair Finch. Judge Finch was a man carved from granite and jurisprudence, known for his unyielding application of the law and a courtroom demeanor that could freeze mercury. His career was a monument to order, his life a fortress of routine. The box, therefore, was a stark anomaly. It was wrapped in pristine white paper, adorned with a single, blood-red silk ribbon tied in a perfect bow. There was no postage, no return address. It simply sat on his marble doorstep as if it had materialized from the downpour. His housekeeper, a woman named Elena who had been with him for 2 decades, discovered it. She assumed it was a gift from one of the many legal foundations or charities the judge supported. She brought it inside, placing it on the mahogany table in the grand foyer, the crimson ribbon a slash of vibrant color in the otherwise muted, masculine space. Judge Finch arrived home precisely at 6 o'clock, as he did every evening. He saw the box and raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "An admirer, Elena?" he rumbled, his voice a low gravel. "It appeared this afternoon, sir." "There was no card," she replied, taking his drenched coat. He approached the package with a certain academic detachment. The craftsmanship was exquisite. The paper was thick, expensive stock, the ribbon of the highest quality. He ran a finger over the knot, then, with a silver letter opener from the hall table, he sliced through the paper with surgical precision. He lifted the lid. For a moment, he was still, his mind refusing to process the image his eyes were relaying. The object inside was nestled on a bed of black velvet, cushioned as if it were a priceless jewel. But it wasn't a jewel. It was a human head. The eyes were closed, the skin waxy and unnaturally pale, as if it had been professionally treated by a mortician. The hair was dark and neatly combed. The expression was one of serene repose, a terrifyingly peaceful mask on an object of ultimate violence. The cut at the neck was clean, precise, almost surgical. Judge Finch, a man who had stared down murderers and sentenced men to death without flinching, felt the foundations of his world crack. A sound, a choked, guttural gasp, escaped his lips. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his mouth, his fortress of order utterly annihilated. By the time Detective Miles Corrigan and his new partner, Detective Isabella, Izzy Rios, arrived, the Finch estate was a controlled chaos of uniformed officers and forensic technicians. The air buzzed with hushed, frantic energy. Corrigan, a veteran homicide detective just 3 years from retirement, had a face like a worn roadmap, etched with the tolls of 1,000 grim cases. He moved with a weary deliberation, his gaze missing nothing. Izzy, by contrast, was a live wire. Barely 30, she had a reputation for being sharp, relentless, and possessing an almost unnerving ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. She was a rising star, and this was her first high-profile case since being promoted to homicide. They found Judge Finch in his study, a glass of amber liquid trembling in his hand. He was a shadow of his public persona, his face ashen, his voice a strained whisper as he recounted the discovery. There was no note? No symbol? Nothing? Corrigan asked, his voice gentle but firm. Nothing, Finch rasped. Just that, presented like a trophy. Izzy was in the foyer watching the forensics team work. She crouched low, her eyes scanning every inch of the box and its former contents, which were now being carefully documented. The head is preserved, she noted to the lead technician. This isn't fresh, but it's not decayed either. There's skill here, taxidermy, perhaps, or high-level mortuary science. The cut is post-mortem, the technician confirmed, executed with a very sharp, thin blade. No hesitation marks. Our killer is confident. And a perfectionist. Izzy looked at the crimson ribbon, which a technician was carefully placing in an evidence bag. The presentation, she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. This isn't about just killing. It's a statement, a performance. The next day, the city awoke to the horrifying news. The head in the box, the tabloids screamed. Fear, a commodity more infectious than any virus, began to seep into the bedrock of Viridia. The victim was eventually identified as a John Doe, a homeless man who had vanished from a downtown shelter 2 weeks prior. There was no connection to Judge Finch, no discernible motive. It was a terrifyingly random act of brutality. And then, a week later, it happened again. The recipient this time was Eleanor Vance, the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical corporation. Vance was a titan of industry, a woman known for her ruthless business practices and a public image as polished and impenetrable as diamond. The box was identical, pristine white paper, a single crimson ribbon. It was delivered to her corner office on the 80th floor of the Vance Tower, bypassing security with an ease that baffled investigators. Her assistant, a nervous young man named Arthur, signed for it, assuming it was a promotional package. Eleanor opened it during a board meeting, her initial annoyance turning into a silent, blood-draining scream that echoed in the sterile boardroom long after the sound had faded. This head, too, was perfectly preserved, nestled on a bed of black velvet. It belonged to a Jane Doe, a young woman whose disappearance from a nearby city had barely made the local news. Once again, there was no connection to the recipient. The city's nascent fear blossomed into full-blown panic. Corrigan and Izzy found themselves at the center of a media firestorm. They worked around the clock, their office a chaotic mess of crime scene photos, city maps, and coffee cups. 2 recipients, Corrigan said, pacing in front of a whiteboard covered in their frantic scrawls. A judge and a CEO. On the surface, no connection. Finch is old money law. Vance is new money pharma. They don't move in the same circles. It's not about them, Izzy insisted. Her eyes narrowed in concentration as she stared at the board. The killer is using them. They're the stage. The heads are the message. But what is the message? She tapped a photo of the perfectly tied crimson ribbon. And this is a signature. Deliberate. Elegant. It's mocking us. They dug into the lives of Finch and Vance, searching for any thread, however thin, that might connect them. They interviewed terrified colleagues, resentful former employees, and bitter legal rivals. Nothing. The killer, who the media had now dubbed the Crimson Gifter, was a ghost, their motives an enigma. The third box arrived 10 days later. It was placed on the steps of the city's Grand Cathedral, addressed to Father Michael, a beloved public figure known for his charity work and his progressive sermons. This time, the head inside belonged to a young man who had been a low-level drug dealer, another forgotten soul from the city's underbelly. The city teetered on the edge of hysteria. The wealthy elite hired private security. The streets grew quiet after dark. The Crimson Gifter had become Viridia's very own boogeyman, an invisible phantom who could breach any defense to deliver a package of unthinkable horror. Izzy felt they were missing something fundamental. She spent her nights poring over old case files connected to the 3 recipients, convinced the link wasn't in their present, but in their past. Corrigan, though skeptical, trusted her instincts. He'd seen that fire in a detective's eyes before, and it often led to a breakthrough or a burnout. It was 3 a.m. when she found it. A sliver, a ghost of a connection. It was a corporate manslaughter case from 15 years ago. A small, independent chemical plant on the outskirts of the city had suffered a catastrophic failure. A toxic leak had killed 7 workers and poisoned the local water supply, leading to a cluster of birth defects in the surrounding, low-income community. The company was a subsidiary of a larger conglomerate that was later acquired by Eleanor Vance's corporation. She had personally overseen the legal strategy that limited the company's liability to a pittance. The judge who had presided over the case, dismissing the class action lawsuit filed by the families on a technicality, was a younger, less formidable Alastair Finch. And the man who had provided spiritual counseling to the grieving families, urging them to accept the court's decision and find peace in forgiveness, was Father Michael. "This is it, Miles," Izzy said, her voice electric with discovery as she slammed the dusty file down on his desk, waking him from a brief, uncomfortable sleep in his chair. "This is the connection." Corrigan rubbed the sleep from his eyes and scanned the documents. "It's thin, Izzy. The 15-year-old case. They played their parts, sure, but thousands of people were involved. But they were the faces of it," she countered, her finger tracing their names in the old court documents. Finch was the face of the law that failed them. Vance was the face of the corporate greed that caused it. And Father Michael was the face of the moral authority that told them to accept their fate. They were the pillars of the injustice. It was a theory, a fragile thread in a storm of chaos. But it was the only one they had. As they began to dig deeper into the forgotten tragedy of the Blackwood chemical spill, they had no idea that they were prying open a Pandora's box of pain and rage. They thought they were hunting a killer who sent pieces of the dead to the powerful. They were about to discover that the gifter's performance was merely the overture. The main act, a symphony of vengeance far more brutal and personal than they could ever imagine, was about to begin. And the next delivery would not be a head in a box. It would be a live performance, broadcast for the entire terrified nation to see. The lull between the third gift and what came next was a deceptive calm. For 2 weeks, the city of Viridia held its breath. The silence from the Crimson Gifter was more unnerving than the deliveries themselves. It was the quiet of a predator gathering its strength, the stillness before the strike. Detectives Corrigan and Rios used this time to frantically excavate the cold, buried case of the Blackwood chemical spill. They found a tragedy that the city had willfully forgotten. The 7 workers who died were immigrants, men with families who were left with nothing. The community poisoned by the spill was a ghost town now, its residents scattered, their lives irrevocably scarred by illness and loss. The man at the center of it all was the plant's foreman, a man named Marcus Thorne. He had been the primary whistleblower, a man who had presented damning evidence of safety violations and faulty equipment, all of which had been systematically ignored by the parent company. His testimony was the cornerstone of the class action lawsuit. When Judge Finch dismissed the case, Marcus Thorne was ruined. He was blacklisted from the industry, branded a troublemaker. His wife, who had suffered a difficult pregnancy due to the contaminated water, gave birth to a son with severe, debilitating health issues. The weight of the guilt, the injustice, and the financial ruin crushed him. 1 year after the verdict, Marcus Thorne took his own life. "This has to be it," Izzy said, her voice low. She stood before the whiteboard, which was now dominated by a photo of Marcus Thorne. He was a man with kind eyes and a weary smile, a man who looked like he carried the world on his shoulders. The rage from this, it never went away, it just went underground. "So we're looking for a relative? A child?" Corrigan mused, chewing on the end of a cold cigar. Thorne had a son, but the records show the boy died a few years after Marcus. The mother, Sarah Thorne, she fell off the grid completely. "Or," Izzy countered, circling Thorne's photo with a red marker, "we're looking for someone who saw him as a father, a protege, someone who inherited his rage." Their investigation was interrupted by a citywide alert. Every television screen, every public digital billboard, every computer in their own precinct, flickered and changed. The scheduled programming was replaced by a single stark image. A man, gagged and bound to a steel chair in a dark, cellar-like room. He was alive, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. A digital clock in the corner of the screen began a 60-minute countdown. A voice, distorted by a synthesizer, echoed through the broadcast, a cold, robotic monotone that was devoid of all emotion. Good evening, Viridia. For 15 years you have slept soundly, believing that justice was served. You were lied to. Tonight, the performance continues. Tonight, you will be the audience for an act of true justice. The man you see before you is Mr. Gerald Byrne. He was the lead chemical engineer at the Blackwood plant. He was the man who falsified safety reports. He was the man whose lies sent 7 men to their graves and a good man to his own. He walked away with a severance package and a clean conscience. That, the voice paused, the silence hanging heavy and sharp, is about to be rectified. You are all witnesses now. The show will begin when the clock hits 0. The broadcast was untraceable, a sophisticated hijack of the city's emergency broadcast system. Panic erupted. The police department was thrown into a state of high-alert chaos. Corrigan and Izzy watched the screen in their office, a shared sense of horror and helplessness washing over them. They knew Gerald Byrne. His name was in the Blackwood file. He was a key witness for the defense, the man whose perjured testimony had dismantled Marcus Thorne's case piece by piece. He's not just killing anymore, Corrigan whispered, his face pale. He's making the whole city his accomplice. For an agonizing hour, Viridia watched a man's life count down. When the clock reached 0, the screen did not go black. A figure emerged from the shadows behind the chair. They were dressed in dark, industrial coveralls and a welder's mask, their identity completely obscured. The figure held no gun, no knife. In their hands, they held a set of powerful hydraulic cutting shears, the kind used by firefighters to cut through metal. What happened next would be seared into the nation's collective psyche forever. It was not a swift execution. It was a methodical, unthinkably brutal act of dismemberment, broadcast in horrifying high-definition clarity. The figure worked with a chilling, detached precision, as if they were not taking apart a human being, but dismantling a machine. It was a gruesome, visceral refutation of the clean, surgical cuts found on the gifted heads. This was not about precision. It was about destruction. This was rage, pure and unfiltered. When it was over, the masked figure stood for a moment amidst the carnage. They raised a gloved hand and pointed a single finger at the camera. Judge Finch, Ms. Vance, Father Michael, the distorted voice said, each name a dagger. You were the architects. This is the house you built. There are more rooms to visit. The screen went black. The city was traumatized. The case of the Crimson Gifter had evolved into the terror of the Blackwood Avenger, a killer who was both a ghost and a performer on the grandest stage imaginable. The FBI was called in, but the case remained Corrigan and Izzy's. They had found the source, the original sin of Blackwood, and now they were in a desperate race against a killer who was operating on a 15-year-old timetable of revenge. Their focus shifted entirely to the victims of the spill and the employees of the plant. They began re-interviewing the families of the dead, the residents of the poisoned community. They were met with a wall of silence. The pain was still too raw, the distrust of authority too deeply ingrained. To these people, Marcus Thorne was a martyr, and while they didn't condone the Avengers' methods, they understood the rage that fueled them. It was Izzy who noticed the name, buried deep in the plant's old employee records under the maintenance department. Ethan. Just Ethan. No last name listed, a clerical error common with temporary contract workers. But there were notes in his file written by Marcus Thorne himself. Ethan is a brilliant young man, a natural with machinery. He sees the world in terms of systems, how they work and how they break. Taking him under my wing. Marcus was his mentor. Izzy realized, her heart pounding. He wasn't just an employee. Thorne was a father figure to him. They could find no other record of an Ethan working there. He was a ghost in the system. But as they cross-referenced the few details they had with social security numbers and old city directories, they found a possible match. Ethan Croft. A boy who had been in and out of the foster care system, a genius with mechanics and engineering who had aged out of the system right around the time he would have been working at the Blackwood plant. His last known address was in the now-abandoned district poisoned by the spill. As they prepared to lead a SWAT team to the derelict neighborhood, a second broadcast began. This time, the victim was the lawyer who had represented the chemical company, the woman who had personally cross-examined and humiliated Marcus Thorne on the stand. She was tied to a chair in a different room, this one resembling a decaying laboratory. The Avenger's voice returned, colder and more resolute than before. The law is a tool. In the right hands, it can build. In the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon. This woman wielded it as a weapon to destroy families. Tonight, we will deconstruct her argument. And her. This time, the method was different. On a table next to the bound lawyer was a set of chemical beakers and containers. The Avenger, again in a mask and coveralls, began mixing chemicals with the calm, steady hand of a practiced chemist. The countdown clock was on the screen again. Corrigan and Izzy knew they would never make it in time. They were watching another person's last hour on Earth tick away. But this time, Izzy noticed something. In the background, behind the victim, was a faint, peeling logo on a piece of old machinery. It was the symbol of the Blackwood chemical plant. "He's there?" Izzy breathed, her eyes locked on the screen. "He's not in some random basement. He's at the plant. He's turned the site of the original crime into his theater." The abandoned Blackwood plant was a sprawling, skeletal ruin, a testament to a forgotten tragedy. It was a maze of rusted catwalks, shattered windows, and vast, echoing chemical vats. As the SWAT team converged on the location, Corrigan and Izzy went with them, their hearts pounding with a mixture of dread and adrenaline. They were entering the monster's lair. The live broadcast was their map. They used the visuals to navigate the labyrinthine complex. As the countdown on the screen neared its final minutes, they stormed the building they believed was the source. They found the room from the broadcast. It was a horrifying tableau of blood and chemicals, the lawyer's body a testament to the Avenger's chemical expertise. But the room was empty. A television screen on the wall showed the live feed, which was now on a slight delay. They were seeing what had happened minutes ago. Then, the face of the Avenger appeared on the screen, the welder's mask looking directly at them. He was in the control room watching them on the security cameras. "You're too late, detectives," the distorted voice echoed around the room. "You were always too late, 15 years too late. But I'm glad you came. You've arrived just in time for the finale." The screen changed to show a new image. It was Judge Alistair Finch. He was not bound to a chair. He was standing on a narrow catwalk high above the floor of the plant's main processing chamber, a massive, empty silo. And standing behind him, holding a remote detonator, was the masked figure of the Avenger. "The judge was the easiest to catch," the voice mocked. "He lives in a fortress of wealth, but he was already a prisoner of his own guilt. Welcome to my courtroom, Detective Rios. You are the jury. Now, let's hear the final verdict." The air in the vast processing chamber was cold and thick with the ghosts of industry. High above, on the rusted catwalk, Judge Finch stood like a condemned man, his expensive suit a dark smudge against the decaying metal. The masked figure of the Avenger, now revealed to be Ethan Croft, stood behind him, a specter of vengeance. Below, Izzy and Corrigan stood on the concrete floor, their weapons drawn, their beams cutting through the oppressive darkness. The entire SWAT team was positioned around the chamber, a ring of silent, armed witnesses to the final act. "Turn on the lights, Ethan." Izzy's voice boomed, amplified by the cavernous space. "Let's end this. No more games. No more broadcasts." In response, a series of harsh, industrial floodlights flickered on, bathing the chamber in a sterile, white glare. The scene was stark and terrifying. Ethan held the detonator in one hand. With the other, he removed the welder's mask. The face they saw was not that of a monster. He was a man in his mid-30s, with intelligent, haunted eyes and a face etched with a pain so deep it seemed to have carved lines into his skin. There was no madness in his expression, only a chilling, absolute resolve. He looked down at Izzy, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Detective Rios," he said, his real voice clear and steady, free of the digital distortion. "I'm glad you're the one to see this. You at least bothered to read the history. It doesn't have to end this way, Ethan," Corrigan called out, his voice steady, trying to de-escalate. "We know what they did. We've reopened the Blackwood case. There will be justice." Ethan let out a short, bitter laugh that echoed unervingly. "Justice? There is no justice in your world. There is only law. I saw what the law did to a good man. I saw it break Marcus Thorne. He was more of a father to me than anyone. He taught me, he trusted me, and he died believing the system he trusted had betrayed him." "Your system," he said, his gaze locking onto Judge Finch, "failed." The judge, who had been trembling, seemed to find a sliver of his old courtroom authority. "You are a murderer," he declared, his voice shaking but firm. "You are a butcher who mutilates the innocent." "Innocent," Ethan retorted, his voice rising with a controlled fury. "Were the homeless people I chose innocent? Yes. They were invisible, just like the men who died in your chemical fire. I took them, I gave them a painless end, and I preserved them with a dignity they never had in life. And then I sent them to you. I sent you the forgotten so you would be forced to look at them, to acknowledge them." A sickening realization dawned on Izzy. "The gifts, they weren't random," she whispered, the pieces clicking into place. "The victims, they represented the workers who died. Their anonymity was the point." "She understands," Ethan said, giving Izzy a nod of grim respect. "But the gifts were not enough. They felt fear, but not repentance. So I had to change the performance. I had to make them feel the ugliness of what they created." Byrne, the engineer, lied with his words. The lawyer, she twisted the truth. "I simply deconstructed them, took them apart, piece by piece, just as they did to Marcus's life on the witness stand." "And Father Michael?" Corrigan shouted. "What was his crime?" "His crime was peace," Ethan snarled. "He came to us, the grieving, the sick, the broken, and he preached forgiveness. He told us to accept the will of God. He used faith as an anesthetic to numb our anger. He wanted to bury our rage so his wealthy patrons could sleep at night. He was the most dangerous of them all." Izzy saw her opening. She took a step forward, her hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "Ethan, listen to me. Marcus wouldn't have wanted this monument of bodies. He was a man who fought for justice, not a man who reveled in bloodshed." "You're wrong," Ethan replied, his voice softening with a painful memory. "In the end, he was a broken man. The last time I saw him, he told me something I'll never forget. He said, 'Don't ever let them bury your rage, son. It's the only honest thing you have left. I am his legacy. I am his rage given form and function. This," he gestured around the decaying plant, "is his monument, a theater of consequence." He looked at the detonator in his hand. "There are explosives planted throughout this chamber, on all the support pillars. When I press this, the whole rotten structure comes down. A final, fitting burial for the man who signed the death warrant on justice." "Let him go, Ethan," Izzy pleaded. "Finch will face a new court. A real one. This is the only court that matters now," Ethan said. He then turned his full attention to the terrified judge. "Alistair Finch, for your role in the conspiracy to deny justice to the victims of the Blackwood disaster, for your callous disregard for human life in favor of corporate interests, and for the part you played in the destruction of Marcus Thorne, I find you guilty." Ethan looked down at Izzy one last time. "He's all yours, detective." And with that, he shoved Judge Finch forward. The old man stumbled and fell onto the catwalk, away from Ethan. In the same fluid motion, Ethan turned and ran to the far end of the catwalk, toward the crumbling outer wall of the chamber. "He's not a suicide bomber," Corrigan yelled. "He's making a run for it." The SWAT team's lights followed Ethan as he sprinted with an agility that spoke of years spent navigating this industrial jungle. He reached the wall, kicked out a pre-loosened section of corrugated metal, and disappeared into the night. Seconds later, the world erupted. The explosions were not designed to bring the entire building down, but to cripple it. The pillars buckled, and the catwalk where Judge Finch lay screamed in protest as it tore away from the wall. He was sliding toward the jagged edge, toward the 100-foot drop. Without a second thought, Izzy holstered her weapon and ran. She sprinted toward a service ladder, her mind a blank slate of pure instinct. Corrigan yelled her name, but she was already climbing, her hands and feet finding holds with desperate speed. She reached the top, pulling herself onto the groaning, tilting remains of the catwalk. She scrambled toward Finch, the metal groaning beneath her. She grabbed his arm just as his legs went over the edge. "I've got you!" She screamed over the din of twisting metal and falling debris. For a moment, she held the entire weight of the man whose actions had birthed a monster, her own muscles straining to the breaking point. With a final, primal roar of exertion, aided by Corrigan and 2 SWAT officers who had followed her up, they hauled the judge back to safety. They never found Ethan Croft. He vanished as completely as he had appeared, a ghost returning to the shadows. He left behind a city irrevocably scarred and a story that would become a dark legend. Eleanor Vance was arrested, her company's stock plummeted, and the ensuing investigation unearthed a level of corporate corruption that shocked even the most cynical observers. Father Michael, disgraced, was removed from his position and spent the rest of his days in a secluded monastery, seeking a forgiveness he could never find. Judge Alastair Finch, saved from the fall but not from the consequences, was impeached and faced charges of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The Blackwood case was not just reopened. It became a national symbol of systemic failure. Months later, Izzy stood on a hill overlooking the now condemned and sealed Blackwood chemical plant. The case had made her career, but it had also left a permanent mark on her soul. She had seen the profound horror that could grow in the soil of injustice. She understood, in a way that disturbed her, the cold, clean logic of Ethan's rage. Corrigan walked up and stood beside her, lighting a cigar. "You ever wonder if we'll see him again?" he asked quietly. "No," Izzy replied, her gaze fixed on the ruin. "His work is done. The performance is over. He got what he wanted." "And what was that?" "He didn't want revenge," she said, a sad certainty in her voice. "Not really. He wanted to force the world to listen to a story it had chosen to ignore. He just used blood and bone as his ink." As they stood there, a package courier arrived at the precinct downtown. It was a small, unassuming box addressed to Detective Isabella Rios. There was no return address. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was not a head, but a single, perfectly crafted crimson silk ribbon. And beneath it, a small, handwritten note. It said, "Thank you for listening.